welcome everyone to this 8th Berwick-upon-Tweed Literary Festival. And let me begin by just introducing myself. My name is Stephen Platten, and I live in Berwick, and one of the joys is that I'm actually a good friend of Dermot MacCulloch, who we're going to hear from in just a few moments. It's an exciting moment, this really, because we're all just near the beginning of the festival. Just a reminder to people about cameras and microphones and so on, where you are. And also to remind you all that any of you are very welcome to join in the question answer session at the end. You'll all know where that particular gadget is on your own computer or iPad. And please do send in your questions. We look forward to putting those to Dermot later on. But without more ado, let me just introduce our speaker. He may need no introduction to some of you, because not only has he written a number of books, and substantial books at that, but also has been a star of television, so to speak, particularly on historical programs. And I'm sure some of you may have seen him on those. But perhaps one of the earliest books that really drew people's attention to Dermot was his great biography of Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time of the Reformation under Henry VIII. But since then, so much more has followed. There have been other books on the Tudor period, Tudor Church Militant, which follows up the next period under Edward VI. But then also some much broader books, an amazing book on the Reformation from 1490 to 1700, which is just remarkable in its scope, running all the way across Europe from Gibraltar, so to speak, all the way towards Moscow, and from the North Cape down to Sicily. And then a history of Christianity, the first 3,000 years. Even the title is tantalizing. So you can see we're in for a feast this afternoon. And one of his most recent sets of lectures, which became a book as well, is one called Silence, A Christian History, which were the Gifford lectures given in Edinburgh. Dermot, it's very good indeed to see you. I'm not going to ramble on any further, because what we're all waiting for is to hear from you. And I think you're going to speak for a while and then give me an opportunity to ask a few questions. So over to you.
Thank you, Stephen, for that generous introduction. I'm assuming that everyone can hear me, but no doubt our technical experts will tell me if I'm at the wrong volume or anything like that. We're going to meet Thomas Cromwell straight away in a picture. Here he is. This is, that's not Thomas Cromwell, but Thomas More. We need to go back a bit, I think, for Thomas Cromwell. And a bit more. Here we are. This is Thomas Cromwell as a Georgian Protestant might have seen him in the 18th century. This is a calmed down image of the Holbein picture. Hans Holbein created this image, as so many people at the Tudor court, and captured so much about him. But Thomas Cromwell has been smoothed down here. And so I'm starting here because you might say this is the conventional portrait of Thomas Cromwell as came down through the Protestant version of English history. And a lot of that has hung around the story of Thomas Cromwell ever since. So I'd like to start by sort of gathering what we might know of that conventional story, and then narrow it down bit by bit to what I've discovered and the ways in which the Thomas Cromwell I discovered was very different from this conventional picture. Well, I think virtually any of us who are in this session will know that he was a servant of Henry VIII, faithful servant, or lackey, if you prefer, involved in many of Henry VIII's judicial murders, eventually being judicially murdered himself in 1540. Drilling down a bit on the things we might know, he is associated very much with the dissolution of the monasteries. And Mari Lloyd sang a song in the music halls more than a century ago. I'm one of the ruins that Cromwell knocked about a bit. It's not quite clear whether Miss Lloyd meant Thomas Cromwell or his collateral descendant Oliver Cromwell, who also knocked ruins round a bit. But there it is, there's a fact. And that's associated straight away with the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. And if you think about him in Henry VIII's reign, you'll probably associate him with other Protestants. Stephen has already mentioned Thomas Cranmer, who was Archbishop of Canterbury to Henry VIII. We could also look at a Protestant queen of Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn, or Anne Boleyn, as she's often better known. And Thomas Cromwell and Anne Boleyn have been associated in the popular memory for a very long time. Those of us who did any history or at school on the 16th century, or perhaps at university and were of a certain age, might have written an essay about Thomas Cromwell, taking the phrase, the Tudor Revolution in government. I wonder if I hear any groans around our virtual room at that memory. This was the idea of my great supervisor, Sir Geoffrey Elton in Cambridge, who wrote a book called The Tudor Revolution in Government, of whom the star was Thomas Cromwell, who'd created in Geoffrey Elton's eyes a new sort of Tudor England. Well, he was certainly associated with the revolution, but Elton's revolution was a bit more boring than the religious one. It was a revolution in bureaucracy. So there's a set of things that we might think of as the conventional portrait. Let's move from this smoothed down Georgian portrait to another one of Thomas Cromwell. Have we got another Cromwell up? Yes, smooth down, let's smooth him a bit less. Going on. We're going to stick with Holbein still. This is not very good reproduction. It will remind you perhaps of this original Holbein sitting here. Not very flattering portrait. I'm sure it's accurate. And Holbein was noted for his extraordinary accuracy, but this is not an attractive face, is it? A puffy-cheeked bureaucrat within a minute of losing his temper, clutching a piece of bureaucracy in his hands, soberly dressed. This is an image which hasn't done him any favors. But one thing I'll say straight away is that this image hung in his own parlor. In other words, Thomas Cromwell looked at this image in Herr Holbein's atelier in 1532 and said, yep, that's me, I'll take it. Nowadays, this portrait hangs in New York, in a room in the Frick. Some of you may have seen it, and it hangs alongside another Thomas. Let's see him now. Thomas More. This is a 17th century reproduction, a rather fine one, actually, of the Holbein, which is in the Frick. And even in the 17th century engraving, you see a rather more impressive figure straight away, austere, the sense of those eyes piercing the horizon, a man who is full of integrity and perhaps looking forward to martyrdom, which would come some years later, 8 years later. So this is a rather good, flattering image of Thomas More when we've seen a not very inspiring image of Thomas Cromwell. Let's see these two images side by side as you'd actually see them, either side of a fireplace in the Frick. Well, there's no question that Thomas More comes off best in terms of image out of these two pictures. But there's an interesting thing about them. There's a lot of work being done on these two paintings in the Frick, detail of how they were painted, the details of brushwork and so on. And what has become apparent is that the image of Thomas More was much altered while Holbein was painting it, as if Sir Thomas More had kind of sauntered into the workshop and said, well, Herr Holbein, I'm not sure I look noble and thoughtful enough yet. Could I be just a bit more martyry, do you think? Whereas the image of Thomas Cromwell was not altered at all. What you see is what you get. And that's what Thomas Cromwell accepted for his own parlor. And that's where it hung up to his execution. We know it's the same picture. It's got its, the history can be traced right down to the present day. So yes, he said, that's me. I don't mind. That's right. You may remember a famous quotation about Oliver Cromwell, that collateral descendant of Thomas, who, when he saw a Peter Lely portrait of himself, said, it's warts and all. And that's how it must be painted, warts and all. You might think it's a sort of Cromwell family joke to say that about their portraits. But this interested me as I learned this about the portraits. It told me something straight away about them. Another thing which interested me about Thomas Cromwell was the peerage title that he took in 1536 when he was elevated from being a commoner to being a baron of the realm by his grateful master, Henry VIII. What title would he take? Well, he took the title Baron Cromwell of Wimbledon. Now, Wimbledon means something very particular to us today, but in the 16th century, it had another meaning. It did have a meaning. Wimbledon was a great spreading manor south of the Thames, which had up till 1536 belonged to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now it belonged to Thomas Cromwell. But people would know that within the manor of Wimbledon was a humble village on the Thames itself called Putney. And that is where Thomas Cromwell had been born, where he'd been a child. And he was born simply to the son of a very ordinary man, a miller, a brewer, no pretensions to being a nobleman, of course, hardly a gentleman, though his mother was actually from a gentry family. So to take this title, Baron Cromwell of Wimbledon, think of him swaggering for the first time into the House of Lords that summer of 1536, and think of the affronted nobleman sitting there, particularly one very affronted nobleman, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, one of the biggest snobs in all England, and also very conscious that Thomas Cromwell had pummeled him aside from power. What a furious sense he must have had of this upstart who didn't care that anyone knew that he was the son of Walter Cromwell of Putney, the brewer, the miller. And I rather like that. This is a man easy in his own skin. Now, you see, one of the things that I did in the book was to take evidence, not from documents, but from objects. And one reason for that is the sheer enigmatic quality of Thomas Cromwell. He is an enigma, despite the fact that we have a very large archive from his papers. They were confiscated at his death. So we've got this very large archive, thousands on thousands of items. It actually took me 4 years to go through all the archive that's surviving of Thomas Cromwell. And as I did that, I noticed something very particular and peculiar about this archive. It's what we would today call the inbox of our email. 50 years ago, we'd have talked about the in tray in our office. What it has virtually nothing of is the sent mail, the out tray, the letters that he sent to people, either hectoring them, starting a conversation, or answering their very many numerous queries, the thousands on thousands of pieces of paper that poured into his office. We simply don't have his replies, which is really odd, because anyone who is as efficient as Thomas Cromwell, remember the Tudor revolution in government, would have been very careful to keep a file copy of his answers, but they've all gone. What happened? Well, I can't say for certain, but my theory, which I think is pretty plausible, is that when his archive was confiscated, or just before the confiscation, when his household heard that he had been arrested, they sat up all night with the archive, burning the out tray, burning all those filed copies of his answers, because they thought, if our master is put on trial for treason, it will be much more difficult to convict him if we don't have what he said. Well, it was a good try, didn't work because he was executed. But what it's done is make the man enigmatic. We just don't hear his voice. An enigma is there at the center of this pouring out of archives that I had to deal with. And the person who has done more, I think, to change the image of Thomas Cromwell in a sympathetic, positive direction over the last decade has been my great friend, the novelist Hilary Mantell. And you will have seen on television, perhaps, if you haven't read the novel, the portrait of Thomas Cromwell in Mark Rylance's television performance. There you'll notice how enigmatic he was. That face of Mark Rylance, so inscrutable. Now, if you had gone to Stratford or actually Broadway and seen the play version, the theatre version of Wolf Hall, you'd have seen a different actor, not Mark Rylance, but Ben Miles. And you'd have noticed the way in which Ben Miles leapt about the stage, in fact, on stage, continuously for the 3 hours of the play. Extraordinary performance, but so different from Mark Rylance, the man who was reacting all the time to the court intrigue around him, the man in charge. And so which is the right Thomas Cromwell? They're both based on Hilary Mantell's Thomas Cromwell. Actually, they're both right, because there is the enigma, you see, the missing voice of the man. And that's what Mark Rylance presented on television. And then there is the energy that poured out of him. I must admit, when I came to the end of a day going through the correspondence, about 7 o'clock, looking forward to perhaps a little drink to cheer myself up, I was exhausted. And then I thought to myself, well, so would he have been at the end of that sort of day, reading through that torrent of letters, the pleading, the flattery, the bad news from France, and yet he reacted all the time. For 8 years, he was the chief minister of the king, always reacting. It was an impossible act to keep up. And in the end, of course, he dropped the juggling balls, but the energy was there, the Ben Miles energy. There then is the enigma and the fascination of this man, the energy of the man. How could I build a picture of the man with so much missing? Well, I've had the portrait and the insight that it gave me. Let me turn to something else. Now, let's have another picture. A very particular sort of picture, you see, not a document, but heraldry. Now, heraldry is nowadays a sort of rather pleasant antiquarian pastime. I had great fun choosing my coat of arms with Lord Lion, King of Arms, a year or two back. But that was not the way in the 16th century. It was not a pleasant pastime, but the language of power. It told you things, and you needed to know what the language meant, the message was, just as you and I, at the present day, need to know what road signs mean. And for exactly the same reason, that if we don't understand them, something very unpleasant will happen to us if we are not careful. These two shields are side by side because they are to compare. On the left of your screen is the set of the coat of arms given to Thomas Cardinal Wolsey, who had been the first great master of Thomas Cromwell before King Henry VIII. From 1524, Thomas Cromwell was in the service of Cardinal Wolsey and remained so until the Cardinal's fall in 1530. And you see, Thomas Cromwell here has taken the arms of his master and turned them into his own arms. You see that bit at the top, which is technically called a chief. He's made it into what heralds technically call a pale in the middle, a fess in the middle of the screen. But the same elements you see there, the red rose, they're both servants of the king, so that's the Tudor rose. But beside that, you see two birds, don't you? They're the same birds, though these are different images, so they don't look quite the same. They are, in fact, a Cornish chough, a black bird, the Cornish chough. Now, another name for a chough is Becket. Beckets, these are Beckets. And the point of these birds, you see, is that anyone called Thomas can look back to the arms of Thomas Becket and the memory of Thomas Becket. How ironic, because Thomas Cromwell would end up destroying the shrine in Canterbury Cathedral of Thomas Becket. But the message here is Thomas Cromwell is saying, I am the cardinal's man. And you might say, well, of course he would say that, wouldn't he? He'd taken this coat of arms for his master. But no, because we can date the grant of Thomas Cromwell's arms to 2 years after the cardinal's fall, 1532. Now that is extraordinary. And it had a very particular message at the time. The political message here, the one you needed to listen to, like our road signs, was that Thomas Cromwell, though now in the king's service, rapidly rising in the king's service, was the cardinal's man. He was not anyone else's man except, of course, the king's. Now, at the time, that would infuriate one very powerful lady at court who was on her way to becoming queen, Anne Boleyn. Thomas Cromwell was actually doing much of the spade work to make her queen, but that was his master's wish. He was doing his master's will. But this was a symbol that Anne must remember that he was not her lackey, but in fact, the faithful servant, the man of the man she had destroyed. Anne loathed the cardinal, and it was her who destroyed him. How furious she must have been, but not just her, but her uncle, no one, no less a man than Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, the man we've already seen fuming at the entry of Baron Cromwell of Wimbledon 4 years later. Now, this is extraordinary, isn't it? Because the traditional picture has made Anne and Thomas Cromwell allies. They were both people of the Reformation. But we forget that just because people share an ideology or a belief, it doesn't mean they like each other. And Thomas Cromwell knew only too well that she had destroyed the cardinal. And this explains why in 1536, he made sure that she died. When the king fell out of love with her and they quarreled, Thomas Cromwell pushed on that and destroyed her. And it was actually only after that that he began getting the great honors of state. It was after Anne's death that he became Baron Cromwell, for example. Now that completely overturns the traditional picture of these two, Anne and Thomas. They weren't allies, as they have been seen since the late 16th century. Even more interesting is that this message, this heraldry, would attract the attention of another great lady at the Tudor court, the Lady Mary. Now, this is the daughter of Queen Catherine of Aragon. And it is quite clear that from the beginning of 1536, as the quarrel between the king and his Queen Anne grew poisonous, Thomas Cromwell and Mary became allies. And after Anne's death, Mary was the heir apparent. They were allies, they were close. That once more goes against everything that we thought we knew about relationships at the Tudor court, because of course, Mary, the Lady Mary, became Queen Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary in Protestant mythology, the great symbol of Catholicism. And yet she and Thomas Cromwell were allies. It's complex, it's nuanced, and his story is complex. But he was no less a man of the Reformation. Right from the time that he was working under the cardinal, he was already making quiet contacts with dissenters, Lollards, who would go to feed into the English Protestant Reformation. And his course, the course that he steered through his 8 years as the king's minister, became his own Protestant cause. That's one of the reasons he died, because he was doing something which the king did not want, which was a Protestant Reformation. One last picture before I hand over to Stephen and we consider talking further. One last picture.
We don't have another one.
Don't you?
No, we don't. Sorry.
Ah, how interesting. Oh, well, never mind. The last picture was going to be a picture of a young man, Gregory Cromwell, the son of Thomas Cromwell, the only surviving child of Thomas Cromwell. Now, this young man did something remarkable, or rather his father did something remarkable. He married young Gregory to a lady called Elizabeth Seymour in 1537. Now, who was Elizabeth Seymour? She was the then Queen's sister, Jane Seymour, Queen Jane Seymour. So you see what happened in 1537. Thomas Cromwell married his son to the king's sister-in-law, which in a sort of informal sense meant that Thomas Cromwell became Henry VIII's uncle by marriage. Once more, let's think of how Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, might have thought of that. And every nobleman in the realm. Here was the miller's son from Putney, becoming very, very close to the throne. And if you want an explanation why in the end Thomas Cromwell fell, there is another vital element. So many people were terrified of what Cromwell's power might become. Now that in the end, here is Gregory, round the time of his marriage. And yet another, Holbein dominates our view of the 1530s. He's, as you see, very young here, 17. He married Elizabeth Seymour at that age. She was maybe 2 years older than him. It became a love match, actually. They had children. She defended him after his father's execution. This lovely little image of a boy who's very recognizably Thomas Cromwell's son, you know, the same turned up nose, is actually now in a cellar in Moscow. One of the reasons I can show it to you without fear of much copyright interference is that it's in dispute between the Russian government and the Polish government. It was looted from Danzig in 1945, but there it is. This was unknown early 16th century man until very recently, when a friend of mine, Terry Fitzgerald, conclusively identified it as Gregory Cromwell. It's an intimate image, which was probably in the Cromwell family collection. So this is the boy from Putney, and this is the boy from Putney's son on their way to becoming a dynasty. And so many people wanted that possibility to be stopped. The possibility came when Henry VIII fell out of love with his minister over yet another marriage. Jane Seymour died, and Henry was genuinely grief-stricken, wanted another wife though, and the wife-to-be became a foreign lady. That was important for Thomas Cromwell, not another nobleman's daughter, and this was Anne of Cleves. Now, the Anne of Cleves business is really mysterious because, as you probably know, Henry VIII was very eager to meet her, saw her, and instantly loathed her. And she was not ugly. No one else among the various diplomats and people who'd escorted her from Germany thought there was any problem. Yeah, they looked at her and said, she looks fine. And Holbein's portrait of her is fine, and it is not, as has been traditionally said, a flattering portrait. It's just the same in general terms as an image which the Cleves party had provided. But Henry loathed her. And what could be done? He couldn't get out of the marriage. In fact, the only thing he could do was to get his marriage annulled by clergy, and the only grounds on which he could get the marriage annulled were impotence, that he could not sexually perform with this woman that he loathed. Now, can you imagine King Henry VIII, in any Holbein image you can think of, standing in front of a po-faced set of clergy and saying that, admitting that he could not sexually perform? There is the crucial reason for Thomas Cromwell's fall. I've given you two others, religion and dynasty. Now the crucial one. He had made Henry VIII look a fool. Put it all together, you get an execution in summer 1540. There is the end of the story, perhaps, but now with Stephen, we can perhaps discuss further matters about this extraordinary man.
Many apologies. Can you now see me?
I can. Hello, Stephen.
I'm having trouble in dabbing the screen to bring myself back, as it were. Well, thank you. So that was amazing. And it took me all the way back to reading the book, which was now about probably 3 years ago, and got me so excited. I thought, well, I'm going to start reading it again, but not for just a moment or two. I suppose one of the questions that, in a way, you may have answered it by your presentation that went through my mind was what made you choose? I mean, you've written a lot about the early 16th century and about the Reformation period. What made you choose Cromwell? Because you had such a selection of characters to choose from. You've mentioned so many of them: Wolsey, More, quite a selection of wives. What made you choose Cromwell?
Well, really, there's a sort of inevitability about it, Stephen, because I've lived with Thomas Cromwell since certainly my postgraduate days back in the 1970s, because of Geoffrey Elton. Thomas Cromwell was Geoffrey Elton's hero, and perhaps for the wrong reasons, but there he was, and he appeared in Elton's lectures, which of course I heard as an undergraduate as well. But also when I was writing about Thomas Cranmer in the 1980s and 1990s, there was Cromwell all the time, and I was looking through his papers in order to find out things about Cranmer. So I'd met Cromwell a lot. And so at the end of my active career, I've just retired from Oxford, I thought, well, what would be better than looking at this great central figure of the 1530s, who you can't ignore? I mean, he did remake England in the 1530s and remade Ireland and Wales in the 1530s. So it was more or less not exactly love at first sight, but research at first sight, you might say.
And you talked early on about him having a very unattractive image in many ways. As you researched him, did you come to feel that there were aspects of him that were attractive, or?
Yes, I did, and I think the loyalty to Wolsey is really impressive, because anyone serving Wolsey would be loyal to him during the cardinal's great years of power and splendor. But what was significant was that when the cardinal's power faltered and Anne was attempting to destroy him, Cromwell stayed when other leading servants of the cardinal ratted. I will name one, Stephen Gardiner, who became Bishop of Winchester. He just cleared out and joined the king's service. But Cromwell did something much more subtle. He did enter the king's service, but he stuck with Wolsey right to the end. And in fact, he did something really rather clever, because what he became for the king was a sort of secretary for Wolsey-related affairs. As the king confiscated Wolsey's lands and actually, amazingly, stole Wolsey's tomb for his own tomb, it was Cromwell who managed all that. Cromwell had been managing the tomb for Wolsey, well, now I think that's really how he got in the king's service. He said, Your Grace, I've been doing all the negotiation with these Italian craftsmen. I'll go on doing it for you, of course. So that's really impressive. And I also like this sense of him being easy in his own skin. There's a quality in Hilary Mantell's novels, which I think is exactly right. It's her device, which at the beginning of reading them can be very irritating, that Cromwell is always he. You may remember this, that he is always referred to as he. And that is Hilary's attempt to show that he is distanced, even from himself. And there is a quality in which you see this man looking at the world with a very fresh, original gaze on the world. He was not a typical Tudor Englishman. As you know, he fled not just Putney, but England as a teenager. I think he may have just been bored with Tudor England. And he went to Italy. And he went to the great cities of Italy, Florence and Venice, and made Italian friends and spoke fluent Italian and read Italian all his life. His library had Italian books in it. So this is an extraordinarily cosmopolitan Tudor Englishman. Tudor England was really marginal in Europe in the early 16th century. It's a backwater. And yet this man had seen the center of Europe. He'd seen Italy. And that's what made him special.
And you, talking of Hilary Mantell and her amazing trilogy, what is it then that you can gain from a novelist, as you've already hinted, that you can't really necessarily expect to gain from an academic biography?
Yeah, what a novelist has is the liberation of being able to make things up. Now, of course, you can make silly things up, but what you can actually do if you understand your subject, as I would say Hilary does, is fill in the things which a historian daren't fill in. Because I have to work with evidence. I have to have some clues. It may be that once I've got my set of pieces on the chessboard of the evidence which survives, I can say, well, look, there is a pattern here. Let me suggest what that pattern is. But Hilary never needs to do that. A novelist never needs to say perhaps or might have been. A novelist just uses active verbs. And you can learn a lot from that, from someone who is as immersed as she is in a period. And she's so good at being immersed, not just in the Tudor period, but her terrifying, depressing novel about the French Revolution, for instance, or that wonderful novel Beyond Black about that seedy area around Heathrow at the present day. She just is able to absorb a place, a time, a society. That's what she did with Tudor England.
One of the other things that fascinated me is I remember, I think it was probably in your Cranmer biography, you used that wonderful phrase. I always enjoyed it since, the king's murderous ecumenism.
Yeah.
And I wonder, Cromwell did last quite a long while. He survived much longer than most of the other victims, More and Wolsey and so on, and indeed, of course, Wise. What's your theory for him achieving what he did there?
Oh, he was just so good. And he relieved the king of the responsibility of doing stuff. And that's really important to Henry VIII. He's terribly lazy. He wants to take the credit for everything, but he wants someone else to do the boring detail. And that became painfully apparent after Thomas Cromwell had been executed. Because there's a hilarious document, a memorandum addressed to the king from one of the surviving leading civil servants, a toady called Sir John Gostwick. And it's a list of things that your grace would do well to attend to. And it's a terribly long list. And you can just see Henry over his breakfast saying, oh my God, Who's going to do all this? And then Henry got in a rage with his Privy Council, who had basically destroyed Cromwell in about October 1540. And said, how did you ever let Cromwell die? I need him now. It was too late by then. But a mark of the king's sort of repentance, you could never actually get Henry to say sorry, was that he gave young Gregory a barony. So he became Baron Cromwell, not actually the same barony as his father. This is a brand new peerage. And again, Elizabeth Seymour was clearly very important in that. She was the king's ex-sister-in-law and a remarkable lady. So between Elizabeth and the king's gnawing sense that he'd perhaps not done the right thing by executing Thomas Cromwell, young Gregory got a barony. Not a great intellect, young Gregory, not a terrible fool, but he didn't do much. And of course, he died, poor lad, at the age of 31 in the great sweating sickness of 1551.
And going back to his father, you talked about his youth and going out to Italy and so on, but also you talked at one point about the that sense of ideology, or hinted at it anyway. Does that ideology, was that rooted really a long way into his youth, as it were, or did it develop?
Very difficult to know. The likelihood is that he became keenly interested in Luther's Reformation after 1517. And he did a remarkable trip, actually. In 1520, he went to Rome on behalf of a guild, the Guild of St. Mary of Boston. And very ironically, it was to get a new indulgence for the guild. So that it was a fundraising indulgence. But he told a mate of his in later years, and in fact, the mate was Archbishop Cranmer, that en route, this long journey from England to Rome, he had picked up Erasmus's New Testament, the brand new Latin translation of the New Testament. And that may well have been the spark. It was for so many other people to read the Bible in this new, fresh Latin was something which might make you think, well, perhaps the old church hasn't told us the whole truth. But you see it in the 1520s. As I said earlier, even in the time when he was serving Wolsey, he was already quietly subverting the work he was doing for Wolsey. For instance, recruiting people to Wolsey's splendid new college in Oxford from Cambridge, virtually all of whom turned out to be what we would later call Protestants. It was a great scandal. And it was Cromwell who'd done this, see, using the cardinal's great plans for his own great plans, which were different.
One last little question before I hand over to other questions that have come in. Henry, his nemesis. What is your take? I mean, despite his laziness, was he clever?
Yes, he was. All the Tudors were clever. Remarkable family. He's not the cleverest. I think his son Edward, or possibly his daughter Elizabeth, were cleverer. But there is the laziness, and there is a quality in him which none of the rest of the family had, and that was narcissism. He was utterly narcissistic, totally. It's all about me. It's all about me. And rather like, I won't name a recent American president who is an even worse example and didn't have the talent of Henry VIII. But the same thing applies with narcissists. They make good people do bad things. And I think you could say that about Cranmer. He did bad things as a result of his love of his master, but certainly Thomas Cromwell did. So Henry VIII is a person that the more you know about him, the more you dislike him. But he had charisma, there's no question. Otherwise, yeah. How could he have dominated his court in a way? It wasn't just the power. It wasn't just that he was the king, the Tudor. There was something else there. And it captivated people. It captivated Cranmer, for instance.
That says quite a lot to us about our modern politics, but that's rather another subject. Okay, there's lots of questions here. First of all, it's an interesting one, going back to one of the points you were making. Marilyn Champion asks, can much of Cromwell's outgoing correspondence be tracked down via their recipients' archives?
Ah, very interesting question, a sharp question. Yes, you can, but there are so few archives surviving in such quantity as Thomas Cromwell's. The only other comparable one, which does give us a lot of his answers, is that of Arthur Plantagenet Lord Lisle, who was an illegitimate son of Edward III, therefore related to the king, and had a fairly, well, I wouldn't say distinguished career, but he had a career as Lord Deputy of Calais. And his correspondence survives for exactly the same reason, that in 1540, he was arrested for treason. And so his archive went in. And it's very interesting. It proves my point, actually, because you've got both sides of the correspondence in the Lisle archive. You've got his letters out in the secretary's file copy, but you've also got those answers in. So yes, you can do these, but when you've done all that, you still only have about 300 letters. They're all in a Victorian edition, virtually all by a man called Merriman. But that's it, compared with the literally, I would say 5,000, 6,000, perhaps more items of correspondence in the in tray.
Now, a very different question from Jackie Keynes Lang. She asked, would you classify Cromwell as ruthless?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Clear-sighted, clear-minded, very intent on getting things done, either for himself, for his own particular interests, whether religious or dynastic, but also for the king or for Wolsey. He is that ideal fixer. And yes, you've got to say ruthless. And the way in which he treated those whom the king had decided were his enemies, and perhaps were his enemies in many cases, was ruthless. There's no question. I'm not trying to whitewash the man, but recognize his complexity. He was a bully, there's no question. And people were intimidated by him. He did cross-question people. Don't think he tortured much. He didn't need to, because he could just get an answer by who he was. But yes, ruthless. What else could one say about the death of Queen Anne Boleyn? It was a ruthless operation. I think they loathed each other. And so when she became vulnerable, Cromwell made sure that she wasn't just retired to a nunnery, for instance, but she died.
Now, June Nelson asks us, was it unusual for a humble boy from Putney to seek his fortune in Europe?
Yes, it was very unusual. The only comparable case I can think of at the time would be John Russell, who became the first Earl of Bedford, in other words, the founder of the great Russell dynasty. He spent time abroad. His origins are slightly further up the social scale, but not much. Otherwise, to go abroad like that, the English were literally insular at the time. They didn't go abroad except if they were clergy, senior clergy would, to Rome. Otherwise, no. So yeah, I think I would actually add clergy, and very often their origins were not lowest of the low, but they tended to be the sons of yeomen, merchants, that sort of level. So yes, you can look at others, but the remarkable thing that is that Cromwell and Russell are really the only good examples of people who went abroad like that. And interestingly, they were friends.
Now, the other question is really two questions. So let me give you the first part. This is J. Bruce is asking, is the promise often attributed to Cromwell that he would make Henry the richest prince in Christendom reliably documented?
No, it isn't. And in fact, it's a misunderstanding, which I'm afraid Geoffrey Elton helped to perpetuate, because it's only known in a letter from the imperial ambassador Chapuis to his master, Charles V. It's in Burgundian French, which was the language they commonly used to each other. And if you look at the letter in the original French, which I didn't, I don't think Geoffrey Elton really did, was that you see it's a rather sarcastic passage. He said, and so Monsieur Cromwell met the king after he left Cardinal Wolsey's service, and I bet he said to him that he could make him the richest king in Europe. You see, it's conditional. It's not actually a promise, and it's nowhere else. Of course, it does embody a truth, which Chapuis certainly knew was true, and his master would know true, because that's exactly what Cromwell was doing. But no, it's not there in any policy document.
I think that probably answers the second question, which is, if so, does it amount to almost the only thing we know he said?
No, I mean, to stick with Chapuis, Chapuis, of course, wrote these very conscientious dispatches back to the emperor. They are absolutely invaluable. They're mostly either in Vienna or Spain now, wherever the Habsburg archive ended up, or there are transcripts in London. And they are calendared, in other words, sort of summarized very fully in Victorian editions. And they do tell us a lot, because they were always seeing each other. And the imperial ambassador was the most important diplomat from any other great power in Europe. And these are meticulous, very lively and convincing reminiscences written the same night or the following morning of conversations between Cromwell and the ambassador. They sort of got on rather well. And Chapuis, of course, loathed everything that Cromwell stood for. This obvious predilection for the Reformation, the apparent destruction of Catherine of Aragon, though that's really a slight misunderstanding of the situation. But actually, I think rather admired Cromwell and frequently made that quite clear.
The good one, interesting one here from Aidan McCuffin saying, could you say a few more words about Thomas More, please? Right,
yes. There's a case which I think where here in Mantell has been accused of being unfair to More. And there is a certain truth in that, and Hilary would admit that, because she says she's writing from Thomas Cromwell's point of view. My own take is, again, More is an admirable man. There's no question that to stand up against the narcissist when so many other people didn't was an extraordinarily brave thing to do. He had his cold, dark, harsh, cruel side, and that was directed towards Protestants. He wanted more heretics burned. He said so in his public writing. So if you're going to admit that Thomas Cromwell is ruthless, well, More is also dark. They had probably got on fairly well, and they always respected each other right to the end. But there is no question that More died as a martyr for truth. Cromwell didn't really. And so in that respect, it's easier to admire More, I think. But there is also the other dark side to build in that picture.
And then Nathan Hood asks, why did Wolsey hire Cromwell? And did the church offer a route for the lower classes to ascend the social ladder?
Very interesting question. And this is really the key to how this obscure man who'd just been a merchant, a moneylender in the 15-teens, 1520s, got into public life via Wolsey. Italy, it's Italy. Because in 1524, the cardinal decided to build himself a tomb. That's what you did if you were a really great man at the time. You made sure that you got your tomb built before you were dead. And being Cardinal Wolsey, it had to be the best tomb anywhere. And the competition in England was the tomb of King Henry VII, which you can still see in Westminster Abbey. So Wolsey's tomb would be much, much better, but by the same sort of craftsmen who were Italians. So what Wolsey needed was someone to negotiate with temperamental Florentine sculptors. You can imagine the scene, the cardinal summons this English fixer, Master Cromwell, and says to him, I don't like the way the nose is going on the sculpture on my tomb. Can you do something about that? Get those Italians to change it a bit. And you can imagine then Master Cromwell going back to Signor Rovezzano and saying, "Oh, lovely day, isn't it, Rovezzano?" A few Italian jokes. And the cardinal is so enjoying the way that sculpture's coming on, but perhaps the nose could be just tweaked a bit, just a little. That sort of way of dealing with the Italians was precisely where Cromwell gained his entry into Wolsey's service, and he became the man in charge of Wolsey's legacy project, which wasn't just the tomb, but the great colleges which would pray for the cardinal's soul, and probably the tomb would have been in one of them. We don't really know. And so to set up the colleges, you needed money, and the money came from dissolving monasteries. That's the one thing we really need to build into our picture of Thomas Cromwell. His skill in dissolving monasteries was the work of the cardinal. The cardinal was the man who started the dissolution of the monasteries off, ironically.
Sadly, I think we'll have to stop there. And I apologize to any of the other people who've asked questions. There are still other interesting questions, but we're just running out of time. I think there's one very quick one, perhaps, if I can sum up quickly, and that's Zorine Hill asks whether we know about much snobbery being shown towards Cromwell, apart from the Duke of Norfolk, of course.
Yes, and snobbery towards Archbishop Cranmer too, which was really much less justified. He was a bona fide gentleman by birth. Yes, there are various snide remarks from the nobility. Not all the nobility loathed him. Some were great friends, but there were snobs. And in the end, the king became the arch snob, because in the legislation which destroyed Cromwell, it was enacted that he must now simply be called Thomas Cromwell Shearman. In other words, a worker in the cloth trade. That's just so unpleasant. And in fact, it was just too much, because actually in bureaucracy after that, he was known as the late Earl of Essex, which was his final title. But yeah, there's a lot of snobbery around.
Thank you so much. Just listening to you, it reminded me of having listened to you on other occasions in the past, and always coming away somehow excited to want to go and do more, as it were. Not quite sure what I do here is perhaps read your book again, but who knows, there may be more things. I'm sure there may be more articles coming from you or whatever. So thank you so much for giving us such an amazing afternoon. And let me just remind everyone that here it is, in the hardback version, of course, but it is a paperback version too, available at Greaves, the stationers in Berwick. So please, if you haven't already got a copy, please go along and get one. Thank you too for the audience, for your tuning in, as it were. One of the great things about doing this is that people can come from all over the world. So thank you for coming. Do remind people through the social media of what an excellent thing this was. And also, if you feel like contributing towards the cost of this, which is a free event, but events like this take time and money. So please do help us in that way. More events this time, and next year, October 22, the 9th Festival. Thank you once again, Dermot.
Pleasure. Nice to speak to you, Stephen.